We hope you enjoy this podcast. All our conversations are inspired by films we have selected to appear on SDG.VISION. So go and take a look and be inspired by people and organisations who are making valuable contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and making our world a better place for everybody to live. Now, sit back, enjoy, be inspired, and afterwards, go and take action.
Well, a very warm SDG Vision podcast welcome to Julian Kirby from Natural Neighbours. Hello, Julian.
Hello, Pierre. Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you as well. Thank you for... I know we're sort of disrupting a holiday, I think, at the moment for you. So it just shows your dedication to Natural Neighbours, which is terrific. And we're very grateful. And, you know, we're really glad that you've joined us because we heard about Natural Neighbours after we saw a film on YouTube called Amazing Transformation, Daubney Schools, Rewilding of a Lifeless Plastic Lawn. It sounds a bit like a Radiohead album, that title, Lifeless Plastic Lawn, but it's a great title because it does describe what you're doing. And we thought, well, we'd like to sort of dig a little bit deeper, really, into the work that you do and find out more about what you're currently doing and what your future plans are, and also how it all relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, or if indeed it does relate to the SDGs. So first off, I suppose, as is always the case, what is Natural Neighbours, Julian?
Okay, well, Natural Neighbours is a charity, a London, England-based urban greening charity, community. Is very much at the heart of what we do. So our vision is of towns and cities that are reaching their full potential to host wildlife. And there are numerous reasons for that, and we'll come to that in more depth. But at the very headline level, that's because our health and well-being is inextricably linked to having a connection with nature. And there's really interesting science developing around that. So we need to have an experience of nature in our everyday lives. And many of us don't have that, particularly in towns and cities. Particularly the most marginalised already communities, whether economically, racially, socially, tend not to have that experience of nature. So as a charity, we're about making sure that everyone has that opportunity to have that health-giving experience of nature, but also, as I said, it impacts very much on other areas, notably climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, other forms of inequality in health and well-being.
Yeah, as we often find out on our chats with people, everything's connected, and that no one issue stands alone. So it'll be interesting to sort of find out a little bit more about those connections. And I was just wondering, really, well, for people who may not have thought about this issue too much before, what is the problem? Why is connecting with nature so important? And what do you think are the consequences of us not, as human beings, not connecting with nature?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and I think it's a question that actually many of us live with the consequences of without understanding perhaps what's happening. So yeah, let's unpack that a little bit. Let's start with the individual. So as I just said, health and well-being for us as humans is very much linked to how much we can experience nature. And by experiencing nature, I'm talking about things like just hearing birdsong, seeing butterflies flapping past the window or landing on a flower next to us, bumblebees, often we talk about the right to access a green space. And this is very important, that we can have outdoor spaces that we can go to. But even more important than that is encountering nature in that environment. And of course, when I'm talking about encountering nature, I'm not talking about being chased down by something that's going to eat us, or being annoyed by mosquitoes. As important as those animals are in their ecosystems. I'm talking about the things that actually make us feel human at our best. And there's a lot of science that now shows very, very, very compellingly that cardiovascular diseases, so things like stroke and heart disease and so on, are reduced where populations have more of that access to that experience of nature, the birdsong, the trees, and so on. Children concentrate better at school. Our memories are improved. There are all sorts of impacts. Now, there are questions still around exactly what the causal link is, but the correlations are very, very, very strong. And we know that where people have the experience of nature, they're healthier. So it's therefore an injustice that many of us have that experience of nature and many of us don't. And through the lifestyles, through the environments that we're born into, particularly those densely packed but very bare urban environments, a lot of concrete jungles, as sometimes they're referred to as, those are environments in which people are not getting that experience of nature, and that is directly having an impact on their health, individually and socially. An interesting study not so long ago, a few years ago, showed that even when you control for factors like how much street lighting there is, educational attainment experience in the neighbourhood, distance from libraries, wealth, other demographic factors, and so on, having tree cover in the area was correlated with less crime. So that makes sense if you think about it in terms of what I said before. We're just happier, we're just more relaxed when there's nature around us, and of course then we're less likely to be getting at each other. I'm working out now from individual impacts to social and the health and well-being of social, but of course if we then give right out to the big picture, then climate and biodiversity are very much impacted by how much nature there is in cities. Now, you might think, well, cities are a relatively small area, but actually cities are increasingly a very large area of the planet. They're also where most people live now. And so if you want people to care about and understand the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, then it's important that they have an experience of nature that has been affected by those things too. But also people want to give back. People want to do something about those crises. Eco-anxiety is a really huge phenomenon, and it's growing, and people want to be able to do something. Often we're looking somewhat despairingly at our political leaders, corporate leaders, and want to make some change in our lives as well. And so being able to do something for nature where you live, whether that's in a garden if you're lucky enough to have one, or even just a window box or a pot in a communal space, or a bit of guerrilla gardening by the roadside, then those are things that can make a huge difference and will feel good for you. And the last point that I'll say about this, because again, people might think, well, what can we do for nature in the cities? But actually, for a number of species, cities are actually the lifeline because they're dying out in the countryside. Now in the UK, in England, where I live, there are a number of bumblebee species, for example, that are going extinct in the countryside because of habitat loss, because of chemicals. But gardens are actually very biodiverse. There are a lot of different plant species there, and there are enough of them where people aren't drenching them in pesticides and herbicides that those same bumblebee species are able to hold on. Another example is hedgehogs, which are continuing to decline precipitously in the UK countryside. But there's evidence that actually the fall, and their populations of these gorgeous animals have collapsed over the last few decades in the UK. But that fall seems to have bottomed out and may even be turning around in urban environments. So there's actually a real difference that we can make in towns and cities.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that we think of poverty and we think of people not having anything to eat or enough to eat. There's so many issues related to poverty and lack of access to green spaces and nature is one. That relates to SDG 1, no poverty, but also good health and well-being, SDG 3, it relates to as well. So it shows how sort of complex the issue is. And I know that you do a lot of your work in London and a lot of work in, I believe, in Hackney, is that right? Which is in East London, an old stomping ground of mine. I lived there for years. And, there are green spaces, but generally throughout your day, you won't be seeing much green space. And I can attest to how that impacts on your mental well-being. In terms of your work, how have you noticed, your work with children particularly? I know that you do work in schools or with schools as well as community centres. How do you see that impact on children in terms of the work that you do, connecting them with nature?
So we're based in Hackney, and that's where we're starting out, but we're expanding across London over time, hopefully beyond London. And perhaps even beyond the UK one day. So, yes, how we see that impact play out, again, it is multiple ways. And I'll illustrate with some stories perhaps as well. In fact, I'm going to start there because this is one I often tell, which I really, really love. So we recently built a big wildlife pond with the kids and with the staff at a place called the Hackney Marsh Adventure Playground, and that's in the corner of a bit of park that people walk. So it's just bare grass outside that, and then a wireframe, and then you've got this adventure playground, which is a fantastic place run by fantastic people inside. Now, across from there, about 50 metres across the grass on the other side of the park, is a tower block. Now, one day I was working on that pond, putting its final touches in, and a little girl, she's about 8 years old, I think, came over, and there's a constant stream of children coming over, and they're just absolutely entranced by the pond. There's something about water, and I talked earlier on about, we've both talked about how green spaces are important, but actually blue spaces, so spaces with water, and the science around the health impacts of those is even stronger. So there's something even more powerful about being by water, and having some sort of interaction with water, healthy water spaces. So yes, the children are gathering around this pond. They're absolutely entranced by it. There were tadpoles in it, which they were just absolutely amazed by, already. And so many dragonflies flying around. And this one little girl says to me that she loves the pond and she looks at it every day. And she lives in the tower block just across, and she lives on the 8th floor of that tower block. And she says, I borrow my parents' binoculars and I study the pond. So even when she goes home, she's looking out the window at this thing, watching the birds and looking for the animals in there. What that's done, and why I love that little vignette there, is it's showing how a little corner of nature has opened up a whole new world, a whole new universe to these incredible imaginations of children. And they're entranced by it. And that, of course, is distracting them from things that may be less healthy for them, like getting into TVs and games and screens and so on, which have a place, but let's be honest, we have to control them. And I know from a parent myself, that's very difficult. So if your child is going over to look at a pond instead of going straight to a screen, then how good is that? But also, it's calming and it's feeding that imagination. And she's just full of questions. What's this? What's that? And so on. The staff there are constantly coming up to me with stories about how different children have often really surprised them by how much they're interested in the pond. They talked about a child who has a lot going on in his personal life, some safeguarding issues at home. So often they're dealing with, essentially they're kind of social workers there, and they're dealing with, people who have got all sorts of stresses going on in their lives. And then they're finding that very troubled children are just calmed and they're just entranced and they're just shifted into a different gear. We've all got the experience, I'm sure, of stepping outside the door, and then there's something about just being outside that calms us. And even more than that is when we're stepping into a natural environment, and that transports us. And I think there's a lot going on in that word, transports us, emotionally, physically, and so on. We've also worked with a school, and this is the video that you've referred to at the beginning of this. And so they're using the ponds there and the wider environment that we've transformed this space. It was plastic grass and now it's clover lawn and planting and bushes and growing fruit and veg. But they're also digging holes and looking for worms and so on. And so they're learning a connection with the world that they wouldn't have had. And many of the children at our local schools in Hackney, across London, they do not have any experience, certainly any daily experience of nature. And so it's so important that at school age that they're given that, because when they get through school age, then that's probably it in terms of having a formative experience of nature that then goes into their sort of understanding of the world, their values and their personalities. So it's very, very crucial that children are given that opportunity at that age.
And it's perhaps not too surprising, that connection, because we often forget that we are actually part of the natural world. We are all part of the same ecosystem. And, you take that element away, and as you say, there are some profound consequences for that. I was wondering also in terms of the work, so there's people, children engaging with nature in terms of enjoying it and interacting with nature, be it through binoculars or up close in the pond. Do the children also engage in the construction and development of the projects at all? And if so, do you see any change in them in terms of perhaps their self-confidence or opening up, or in whatever way?
Yeah. So our model is very much about community engagement and involvement right from the beginning. So we to illustrate by comparison, we could be a contractor and the school says, I want a pond, and we come in and build a pond and go away again. But we're all about the community and all tiers of the community, all demographics, all ages, sharing their thoughts and informing a design process with their likes and dislikes of the environment as they've got it, and their aspirations for what it could become. And then, of course, really importantly, how they're going to be involved in continuing to maintain it, to steward it, and to showcase it, to make it something that the wider community is involved. Now, I know that you've asked me in particular about children there, but just before that, the broader community in that school, surrounding Daubney School where this video is shot, they have potentially, and this is what this is our model, this is what we're working with them, and we've got a fantastic leadership of the school there. What we're doing is we're developing in a way new forms of commons, a new form of commoning rather, where if you think of schools, certainly in the UK, and it might be the same globally, and I know it changes, and there is some really interesting stuff happening around this in Paris, for example, but schools are essentially little parklets that sometimes they have great green in them, sometimes they're not. They're all asphalt and plastic grass, and we want to change those ones. But whatever they are, they're locked away at the weekend, they're locked away in the holidays. And so there's an enormous opportunity cost in terms of a resource that the community could access but can't because they're locked up. And they're locked up for good reasons around protecting the property and safeguarding and so on. But what we're looking to do is to make that space something that the community can be involved in and make use of, and in return for doing that, they can nurture it and they can do watering of the trees and so on. And so that's the model that we've been trailblazing, and that's what we want to roll off in other places. Now, this was by way of answering how are people involved and how are children involved in the design. When you're thinking about how you're designing a project, you also need to think about that long-term maintenance, of course, don't you? So that's sort of bring that whole circle back there. We surveyed the children, and we surveyed the adults, the staff and volunteers, and we surveyed the wider communities. And actually, it started with the children in this school. They listed, there's an eco team who are sort of environment champions within the school, and they went to all the different classes and they interviewed each class, essentially, what do you like about the space? What do you not like? What would you like to change? For example, we want to put some trees into the playground because that's going to provide shade. There's a large asphalt playground that's an oven in the summer. Where would you like those to go? Where would you not like those to go? Those answers then formed the stock that then we put out to the wider community. This is what the children want. What do you think? And getting them to respond to that. One thing I want to say, in addition, because this is an exciting piece of work that we're developing, is that we are going to start a project where we have what we're calling natural champions. So these are young people, 10 to 16, and they are going to be working in particular at the Hackney Marsh Adventure Playground to begin with, but also a little bit in the Daubney School space. And then as we progress with other projects across these other projects. But the idea is that we are equipping young people with the skills, with the confidence, with the knowledge to be advocates for the local environment, for nature in the local environment, and also to try their hand at designing a space, a little corner of garden, a little bit of the pond, taking responsibility for that at the Hackney Marsh Adventure Playground, as I say, and at the school. And so we can get them actually to be kind of owning a space, if you like. And we know from evidence, we know from one of our great trustees, Gacko John Salmond, who does this a lot with his other work, that when you give children a little bit of a space to look after, then they massively invest in it. They're really proud of it, and they learn so much from that.
It's a fascinating subject. I mean, you remarked about it becoming a commons, or schools becoming a commons, and commons, I suppose you could define as places that the whole community can access. I mean, one commons that I'm really keen on is allotments in the UK, which is areas that are devoted for people who can rent them at a very low price and grow fruit and vegetables on them. And I found that commons is a place where people from all different backgrounds come to and interact and engage with each other because they've got something in common in terms of that they're all interested in growing fruit and vegetables. And sometimes that can be a wonderful thing in terms of knitting people together and making people feel that they have a sense of community. And I love what you were saying about schools, that often they're closed. They're a resource that are only used by children 5 days a week, and they can be used. I think that's terrific, and that sort of creative thinking, I think, could really make a difference to a community. And I love I think you've got a tagline on your website which says "Connecting people, connecting nature," which I think is lovely, and because it's not just about nature; it's about people are part of nature, and it's about connecting people as well. And I wonder whether you've seen that at all in terms of, you've talked about young people having certain responsibilities in certain areas so they can invest in that, and they have a sense of not ownership necessarily, but they're proud of what they've done, and it's an achievement, and it's part of a greater whole. And I wonder whether you've seen children or experienced children's confidence growing, or any sort of improvement in the way that they engage with other children and with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's one word that runs through what we're doing, it's connecting, or connect as a stem. We need, as we've talked about before, to connect with nature for our health and well-being. You can't connect with nature if there's no nature there to connect with. And so how are we going to bring nature into people's lives in towns and cities? Then the answer is that we need to create the networks of habitat for nature to get to where we are. And that's difficult in towns and cities where land ownership management is hyper-fragmented. So the answer there is that we create social networks of nature nurturers who can create habitat in their outdoor spaces or in communal outdoor spaces like schools. And that creates these networks, these corridors of nature can move along and therefore come into our daily lives, where we live and where we work. And when people come to understand that you can do the best thing you can in your space, but if other people around you aren't doing something that supports and works alongside that, then your best efforts aren't going to come to as much as they could do. Actually, I've seen that as quite an epiphany. People are really struck by the fact that, yes, actually, we need all to work together to make this happen. And the reason we talk so much about health and well-being isn't just because there is absolutely a strong line between connecting with nature and health and well-being. It's also because that's something that people very much understand and people very much desire. You don't need too much explaining around to persuade people that being healthier is something you want. Everyone's up for that. And so people are surprisingly energetic and keen and enthusiastic about working together to make their areas, to make their schools more nature rich. And I've had a great privilege of working on a number of sites now where we've had people from all walks of life, all communities coming together and helping out there and forming more friendships, new friendships, whether that's older people or younger people, whether that's children or whoever. So, yeah, that's a joy to watch. It's definitely a thing. People are forming new connections. It's also really important because you've heard of CapEx and OpEx. The capital expense of building something is something that is a challenge. But actually, whether you're a bit of government, a local council, or you're a company or a charity, it's a one-off cost that typically is easier to come up with than the other, which is operational expenses, the OpEx, the ongoing cost of looking after something. So what we're dealing with here is that challenge of how do you deal with the OpEx of having created a lovely nature-rich space, the pond and so on, keeping it looked after. We've put more trees on the playground, keeping them watered and letting them establish and keeping them looked after. The community connections, the networks, the social network that you build around those spaces are actually the solution to the OpEx conundrum, in my view, and in our whole model. And that's why it's so important that we think about what we're doing here as like a new form of commoning with these school grounds or these community adventure playgrounds or community estates and so on, as being a communal space that everybody has a share in, that everyone can derive joy and pleasure from, and also a sense of belonging, that I look after this space and this space looks after me and all of our community. So that's what I'm hoping that we'll see more and more of, and I'm confident that we will see more and more of, is those deepening connections between community as they deepen their sense of connection with the spaces that we're transforming together.
That's interesting, because I think that it hits upon one of my questions that I was going to ask you, in terms of what does success look like in terms of climate resilience, but also in terms of community cohesion in a place like Daubney School, which is the school that we saw your work in the film. What would you hope for that project? What sort of successes do you think are going to be realistic? I mean, you've talked about the operational side, which is a challenge, obviously.
Yeah. So there is the success of the transformation of the space, and that's already there for Daubney. It's already there on some other sites that we've worked on, and there will be more that we can do to transform that space, to add to it and enrich it and so on. But I think more meaningfully, even perhaps, is the creation, the fostering, the ongoing sort of resilience and strength of those community networks around that space. What we want to do when we transform a space like the school isn't just transform that space there and then, but to create a cascade, a ripple effect of people being inspired by that, by having been involved in that, or even just seeing it when they're coming to it, and being inspired to do something similar back at home, as I said, in whatever space they've got. If they're lucky enough to have a garden, to add some transformative habitat, transformative because it adds to the networks that hedgehogs will move along, or frogs, or bats and birds can feed through. Or even if it's a window box and you're putting out some planters there, which are going to feed bumblebees, which actually will only go a few dozen meters before they're starting to get really hungry and thirsty and they need another pit stop. It's surprising how often they need to feed, because there's a lot of energy to flap those wings, right? So we would say that success very much is around creating those communities, what we're calling natural neighbourhoods, where what's gone on in that community is you've got people that have come together under that common cause of nurturing nature, common cause of nurturing and stewarding the spaces that we've transformed, but also in their own spaces, and rippling that through the communities. And what we're working towards is corridors of these natural neighbourhoods. If you can think of them as kind of nodes on a map with concentric circles, and at the centre you've got the dot, which is the site itself, the school or the adventure playground, and then immediately around that you've got a circle of the community who've been involved in that space directly, and then a wider circle is going to be people who have been inspired by that space, people who've heard about it, people who are, through word of mouth, being inspired to do things in their own space. And so success then is around this rolling, cascading sort of transformation of wider neighbourhoods. And we've got this vision over the next 5 years that we're going to create a corridor from Hackney Marshes, and you lived in Hackney, and you'll remember that there's this green corridor, most recently added to with the Olympics Park at the bottom, the Queen Elizabeth Olympics Park. There's a green corridor that runs up through that east part of London along the Lee River, and across into the centre of Hackney Borough, through a number of estates, through a number of very built-up areas, and then to see that succeeding and replicate that in other parts of the borough, in other boroughs across London and beyond there. And what I'm getting at there is we want to, and we believe that we're in the process of scaling a model where, starting at the very, very grassroots level, you can get people transforming a space, transforming their lives, transforming their communities, and other people nearby doing similar, and they connect together. And all of these adding up to a greater whole, where we create these green corridors across cities. When you talked about living in Hackney and that there's lovely green space there, but many of us don't experience that, what you reminded me of when you said that is that there are a lot of green spaces around many of us where we live, not nearly enough, and there needs to be more green spaces. But even where there are green spaces, very often people don't go into them. The fraction of people that access these green spaces is actually quite depressingly small, even people who live right next to them. But even those who go into them, very often they're going in with their headphones in and going running, or they're going in to play football or cricket, and then they're going out again. And this is why the Natural Neighbours proposition, that we need to bring nature into people's everyday lives, as well as, and on top of, trying to create spaces that people can go into to find nature. You know, we've got to actually bring nature to them a bit more and enable them to bring nature to them. That's why that's so important, and I think a fresh perspective. And the only way we can bring nature into people's lives is by creating those corridors of habitat that connect from those green spaces that you've talked about, the parks that are essentially reserves. Often they are very isolated populations of wildlife that, for their own benefit, need to be connected up with other pockets of populations of wildlife, other parks, and so on. And so, success is creating those networks, creating those corridors, starting at those the little dots on the map of those communities and seeing them sort of blurring together and scale up.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking, well, why didn't I access the green spaces more when I lived in Hackney? And to be honest with you, there wasn't a lot of diversity in those green spaces. Generally, it was a park that was pretty much grass and a few trees, and that was it. And it wasn't particularly engaging. But as you say, I think it's really interesting in terms of, it's important for animals and creatures of all sizes to have networks of habitats so that they can move about and they're not confined to one area and in terms of foraging or food or whatever. But it's also important for people to have networks of habitat, and I love that joined up thinking. I think that's terrific. Have you had any chance to talk about this with policymakers or with politicians, or because it makes such sense? And I would have thought 20, 30 years ago, maybe they would have just thought, you were a hippie and, go away and this is airy-fairy talk. But now there's probably a bigger audience for that amongst people who have the ability to make decisions in public life. Has that been the case for you, or is it opening up?
Yes. Now, obviously, it varies hugely in different parts of the world and different parts of the country, even in different parts of a city like London. So in Hackney, we're pretty lucky that, for all its faults, and it does have them. Hackney Council is also quite a pioneer and is brilliant in some important respects. And they're supporting and enabling a lot of work around restoring nature across the borough. And there are some great other projects going on. Renature London is putting in some great habitat on those green spaces and making them less the green desert of just mown grass that you were touching on there. The Mayor of Hackney, Caroline Woodley, came to visit the school a few months ago, as we're talking now, until August. It was back in May, I think, that she came, and brought a couple of her cabinet members with her. And that was great. It was great because it was a real endorsement of our work. It was also a real indication, I think, that, from the top of at least the borough governance, the local government tier of government, there was backing, there was endorsement, and she was saying she wants to see this happening at all schools, and quite right too. The reality is that there are financial problems for certainly Britain's councils. And so not all of them have as much money as we'd like for this kind of thing. But that's where really community groups can do a lot of work if councils, even if they're not spending the money, get out of the way where they need to, or provide in-kind support where they can. And of course there are funds that they can supply. It is true that other government and higher government tiers, for example, the London mayoralship, get that we need to connect people with nature and that we need to involve diverse communities, all communities, in doing that. And they are providing funds for that to happen. So that's encouraging. It's a step forward from where we were a few decades ago, as you say. But there's still enormous inequality. There's still enormous areas of just bare, unhealthy concrete. And so there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And there are a lot of things that aren't being properly looked at yet. There's still far too much chemical use, drenching tree pits and even around schools and nurseries, where it's just mind-boggling that still happens. So there's a lot that government still needs to do to improve. There are regressive councils that are very different to Hackney in respect of looking after the nature, where they're not nearly as supportive. I know from colleagues who do this kind of work across different boroughs, and they're saying that there's a very, very different picture in different places. To date, we've been focused on Hackney, although we'll be opening up projects in other boroughs soon. So I have some optimism, but I also think that there is difficult in terms of government support. In some places, it's very hard, and that's where, coming back to the point earlier on around communities and connections, I think that this model is really valuable around fostering community connection at the very, very grassroots level, because let's be honest, we're also living in an age of a great deal of the worst forms of tribalism and disconnection and culture wars, and something like connecting people under the cause of looking after nature and bringing nature into our everyday lives and just making us healthier. That's a very unifying thing. It's a very inspiring thing, and it's something that undermines the divisiveness, actually, and undermines the hate, and fosters warmth and connection again.
That's a really good point. I think that it creates a foundation upon which a relationship or an interaction on a daily basis can begin. Whereas beforehand, it's like me on the allotment. You meet people who ordinate. You think, I would never speak to them because you've heard them talk about politically something or other, and you don't agree with it. But you find yourself talking about cabbages and carrots and growing and stuff. And it it changes the tone of a discussion of a relationship, and it starts to build a relationship.
Yes.
So I think that's a really, really good point. I think that often we look for difference, don't we? But actually, the commonality amongst us human beings is far greater than the petty little differences we may have. So that's an interesting point, I think.
I like the way you make it, the unifying power of carrots.
Yeah, never underestimate it. That's if you can grow them. I've never had any luck growing carrots, but yes, absolutely. I was wondering, sort of on a supranational level, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals that are set up, initiated by the United Nations. We've got 5 years left of them, and I wonder, does your work relate to it, or organisationally, have you related it to it before, or to them before?
It's something that we talk about with audiences for whom it makes sense. So if I'm giving a talk and it's an audience that are going to be engaged with that kind of level of thinking around Sustainable Development Goals, then of course a lot of grant givers are interested in that kind of thing, because they feel that their mission is to change the world. They want to do that in a way that is an adopted and understood, widespread understood sort of construct, if you like. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals are those things, really, at the very pinnacle. But also, we're very much about wanting to make doing something for nature and experiencing nature accessible to everybody. And so what I would say is that the Sustainable Development Goals are very much, they're driving my work and my whole career, and all of us involved in Natural Neighbours, whether or not we're talking about them. We are working towards the SDGs around health and well-being, as you said, around poverty, because this is very much linked to inequality, again, as we said at the beginning, and of course around climate and biodiversity and healthy cities. There's something that I refer back to from time to time, because when you look at what we're doing and we look at the supranational picture of what as a planet we're trying to achieve, personally I find it quite sort of validating and endorsing to look to those as like our North Stars. This is how we fit into the picture. So actually, even for people who've never heard of the SDGs, I would say the Sustainable Development Goals, in case anyone missed that acronym, I'd say it's worth looking them up and just getting a sense from that, as a planet, there are many, many, many millions of us who are working together to these shared goals of making the health and experience of living here with all living beings, not just humans, better than it is.
Yeah, and just from a political perspective as well, I mean, governments have signed up to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think that, if you're having a conversation with Hackney Council or whatever council, you can say, well, look, what we're doing, we're addressing reduced inequalities, SDG 3, 4, with no poverty, number one, and it's perhaps easier to use that as a framework for them to understand, well, actually, this could be useful to our council, because at the end of the day, politics is a bit of a game, and they want to be able to show that they're doing things that might contribute to something greater or a bigger political vision, perhaps. So it's an interesting thing. Coming back, I suppose, to sort of wrap up, really, as an initiative, you've said that you involve young people in your work, and I wonder, what advice would you give to young people, how to be a natural neighbour, how to engage themselves? Because you've talked about the large and the small initiatives that can happen. What advice would you give?
It's a great question. I think, first of all, is just go outside and just spend a moment being quiet and just sensing and just see, smell, feel, hear what's around you. Do that at home. Go and do that in a park. See what you notice that's different. And tune in, because there is a lot going on in the world around you. And just that act of tuning in to sense, to understand, to perceive the other life forms that are on the planet going about their lives and their struggles next to you is actually very grounding. It's very calming. It's very inspiring. And then from that, you can get a sense of actually how are things getting on where I am? What can I do to support or even to enable where currently they're unable animals to live in the environment around you? Because it's a really wondrous thing, being able to share a space with another organism and another life form, and whether that's plants that you can just sit and watch them grow, and it's an incredible thing to watch something sprout and seed, or whether it's larger, more mobile things like animals, like hedgehogs or frogs or birds and so on. And think about what can other people do as well, and then how can we work together on that. I would encourage anyone to have a look at the Natural Neighbours website. A disclaimer here, we're still working on it, still building it, so there's bits missing. But our framework, our approach is to think about, okay, let's make nature real for us and let's make it accessible. Because a lot of us, I think, are nervous. Like, how do I look after nature? Isn't that best left to the experts? What if I go wrong and, cause a swarm of unhealthy bad things to come along? People have those sorts of worries. And what I'd say is that you're actually fine. You're going to do incredible things. Even the smallest thing, planting a bulb, is going to be an amazing thing to do. A bulb in a pot will feed some bees. But have a look and think about, like, what animals do you relate to? Because this is the approach we take with what we're calling spotlight species, which include the likes of hedgehogs I've talked a lot about, or frogs, or bats and different bird species, and bumblebees and butterflies and so on. The point is that whilst we vary in what animals we're most fond of, there are a number of animals that mostly we find attractive, interesting, and so on. And maybe we want to see a bit more of in our lives. And so you could choose one of those. And then you could look up on the Natural Neighbours website what you can do to help that animal and how other people can. Because everything needs to eat. Everything needs to drink or to hydrate in other ways. Some animals, like frogs, can absorb moisture through their skin. Everything needs to breed, to reproduce, to bring forth the next generation. And then, of course, everything, including us, needs shelter, needs somewhere warm when it's super cold, or somewhere to hide away from things that might eat us. So different animals, of course, need different types of habitat in order to do that. And so you could focus on what the hedgehogs need, and then you and your friends in the local community can then make sure that you're creating that network of habitat that they need. If there aren't any hedgehogs anywhere near you, then perhaps you can choose something else, song thrushes or amphibians, frogs, and so on. So what I'm saying is you can do something. You can enjoy doing something. You can learn a lot of interesting things about looking after nature. And it's so much more fun when you're doing it with other people. And also you're going to feel really good talking to other people about it. So yeah, find out what you can do. Get a bunch of you together, talk about it at school, talk about it with your families, and form a social network of nature nurturers. We are working on an app you might see on our website that we're talking about, the Natural Neighbours app forthcoming. So that will be a tool that you can use as well that can guide you with tips as to what you can do for different animals in future. So yeah, watch this space on that.
Watch this space indeed, and perhaps when the app is up and running, we can get you back, Julian, and we can talk about that, because I think that sounds really interesting. I think, often we criticise apps and modern technology, but actually it can be used for good, and I look forward to seeing that.
Thank you. That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. You've taught us a lot today about connecting people, connecting nature, and how everything is interrelated. And that is really, I think, at the core of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're far richer for learning from you today. And we wish your work all the best. And we think it needs to be scaled up rapidly if we're going to make a more sustainable future for everybody and everything on this planet. So, Julian, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Pierre. It's been an absolute pleasure. And of course, if people want to get in contact with any questions or suggestions, then they can find us at naturalneighbours.org.uk. And looking forward to seeing your podcast. Thanks so much for having us on.
That's a pleasure. Thank you, Julian.
Imagine bees, flowers, bird life everywhere. Your schools, in your gardens, your terraces, your balconies. Even when you open your window, your workplace, a city that's buzzing and singing and blooming with wildlife.
Natural Neighbours is a new charity set up to connect, support and inspire communities to work together, providing a way for us all to communicate and collaborate with each other. Human communities working together as a network to nurture natural communities. The UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. We have a problem where people live in what's called nature deprivation or even nature poverty. That is areas where there is very little, if any, wildlife.
I do think it's wrong that people should be denied the benefits of nature. Do I think experiencing nature should be a human right? I absolutely do.
What wildlife needs, particularly in towns and cities, is more habitat and better connected habitat.
Natural Neighbours is all about connecting communities for the common cause of nurturing nature and connecting nature with people.
There's so much science now that shows that humans need to experience nature to be healthy.
As a head teacher, I think it's critical that our children develop a knowledge of nature. For our young children to get into that culture of engaging with greenery, which then we hope becomes a lifelong habit for them. Natural Neighbours will benefit our community in an array of ways, both physically, in terms of getting out for that physical exercise, socially, and it's good for community cohesion, not only the community directly at our school, but also the local community in general as well.
We need to think of all of our outdoor spaces, balconies, terraces, gardens, communal gardens, as parts of a habitat network. And in order to make that happen, we need to start thinking and acting as communities.
Natural Neighbours is there to support the community. Some people feel like they don't have the right to be out in those green spaces more than others. That's why we're here, Natural Neighbours. We're all about closing that gap and making it for everyone to be able to experience nature and wildlife.
In an urban environment like London or other cities around the country, we sometimes forget that nature is a right to us all. We need to engage with nature, engage with the seasons, enjoy the cold, enjoy the heat, because this is what makes up life and gives us that resilience, not only to enjoy the good times, but to survive the bad times as well.
We owe it to the next generation to restore the natural wealth. And we particularly owe it to the next generation of city dwellers who have little or no daily experience of nature. What we've got here is the most amazing pond that the Daubeny school community, the teachers, the staff, the parents and carers, wider community came together with Natural Neighbours to build. There's a visible and an invisible brilliance to this pond. And the visible brilliance to it is the habitat. It's food and it's drink and it's a breeding place. It's shelter for so much precious wildlife that is now going to come and live here and live in this community around here and just bring its life, its glory, its beauty to the children that study here, to the people who come and use this space. But the invisible value of this is the story of the community that came together to build it. Over a period of days and weeks, formed connections with each other, inspired each other, learnt so much from it that they're now going to go back to their outdoor spaces and do similar things in those places. That really is the natural neighbourhood being built, us all working together as natural neighbours, connecting, collaborating, sharing, inspiring and bringing life back into our communities.
I'm proud to be a part of Natural Neighbours. What I love is that Natural Neighbours is bringing wildlife all the way up to our doorsteps, giving us that experience close up with nature.